They were born while the cannons were still warming their throats. And history would never forgive them for arriving together. In the winter of 1862, when the American sky seemed permanently bruised by smoke and prayer, a black woman named Ruth Holloway labored in silence on a Virginia plantation whose name had been scrubbed from maps, but not from memory. Snow pressed against the cabin walls like an eavesdropper. Outside, men practiced killing one another for freedom they could not define. Inside, Ruth bit down on a strip of cloth and tried not to scream, because screaming invited witnesses, and witnesses in those days could turn a miracle into a grave. When the first child slipped into the world, he did not cry. He opened his eyes. The midwife froze. Ruth froze. Even the wind outside seemed to hesitate. The child's eyes did not wander as newborn eyes should. They fixed themselves on Ruth's face, steady and unblinking, as if he had been waiting for her a long time. Only when Ruth whispered his name, Isaiah, he finally drew breath. A long, trembling inhale that sounded too deliberate to be instinct. Then the second child came, faster, easier, as if following instructions already learned. Elijah, he cried loudly, furiously, like a child angry to be late. His eyes were closed, his fists tight, his face red with life. Normal. Blessedly normal. The midwife crossed herself. 2 boys. Twins, one silent and watching, one screaming and alive. Ruth held them both, and felt joy clawed fear. In 1862, a black woman bearing twins was already an act of defiance. But a child who did not cry, who looked as if he remembered something no one had taught him that was danger dressed as wonder. Isaiah learned the world too quickly. By 3, he could trace letters in ash on the cabin floor after seeing them. Once copying shapes from scraps of newspaper the plantation owner used to wrap meat. By 4, he corrected the Bible verses read aloud by the white preacher who visited once a month, his small voice interrupting with gentle certainty. That word comes later, he would say. You skipped something. Ruth begged him to be quiet. Elijah learned to cover for him, coughing loudly when Isaiah spoke, knocking over bowls, drawing attention away. The twins became a single organism, one mind split between caution and curiosity. Elijah watched the world. Isaiah watched the past. At night, Isaiah whispered things that had no place in a child's mouth. Names of battles not yet fought. Rivers choked with bodies. Bells ringing in cities he had never seen. Once, during a thunderstorm, he clutched Ruth's wrist and said, very softly, they're burning Atlanta again. Atlanta would not burn until the following year. Ruth stopped sleeping. Word travels faster than mercy in places built on chains. The overseer noticed Isaiah's gaze, how it lingered too long, how it seemed to weigh men and find them lacking. He laughed at first, called the boy little professor, made him recite numbers for entertainment. Isaiah did, obediently, but his voice trembled, as if each answer cost him something invisible. Then the plantation owner, Mr. Caldwell, summoned Ruth to the main house. She scrubbed her hands raw before going. She left the twins with an old woman who promised to pray without asking questions. The hallway smelled of polished wood and old blood. Caldwell sat beneath a portrait of his father, a man whose eyes were as cold in paint as they must have been in life. I'm told one of your boys is unusual, Caldwell said. Ruth said nothing. He reads, Caldwell continued. He remembers. He listens in ways that unsettle people. Ruth stared at the floor and thought of Elijah's cough. Isaiah's whispers, the way miracles always arrive hungry. Caldwell leaned forward. The Confederacy needs minds as well as bodies. The Union too. Information is currency now. Secrets win wars. Ruth understood then that Isaiah was no longer a child in their eyes. He was a resource, a tool, a thing to be extracted. That night, she packed what little she could carry and planned to run. North was a rumor, but it was a rumor with direction. She would take the twins and disappear into forests that swallowed names. But Isaiah woke before dawn, shaking. "They already know," he whispered. "They're coming tomorrow, not soldiers. Men with questions." Ruth held him and felt the weight of inevitability press down like a hand on her chest. Elijah stood in the doorway, listening, older than his years in the way only children in danger ever are. Morning came anyway. Two men arrived on horseback, coats too clean, eyes too sharp. They spoke politely. They spoke softly. They asked Isaiah to show them his numbers, his letters, his memory. Elijah tried to interrupt. Ruth tried to refuse. It did not matter. Isaiah answered. He named dates. He recited troop movements reported weeks later in newspapers. He described a battle near Antietam with such precision that one man had to turn away, pale as if seeing it unfold in real time. Blood-soaked imaginary fields. The air filled with screams only Isaiah seemed to hear. When it was over, silence swallowed the cabin. The men did not smile. One of them knelt in front of Isaiah and said, almost kindly, "Do you know why God gives gifts like yours, son?" Isaiah shook his head. "So they can be used." That night, Ruth held her boys, as if trying to fuse them back into one body. Elijah cried without sound. Isaiah stared at the ceiling, tears sliding into his hair, his lips moving in a prayer that did not belong to any church. Just before dawn, Isaiah whispered something that froze Ruth's blood. "They won't take both of us," he said. "Only me." Outside, horses snorted in the cold, and boots crunched slowly toward the door. Boots stopped just outside the door, close enough that Isaiah could hear the leather creak as a man shifted his weight. The sound lodged itself inside his chest like a nail. Ruth tightened her arms around both boys as if pressure alone could make the world reconsider. Elijah pressed his face into her side, breathing fast, counting her heartbeats the way Isaiah had taught him. 1, 2, 3, because numbers were safer than fear. The knock did not come. Instead, the door opened slowly, with groaning as though it too wished to resist. The men entered without apology. The taller one removed his hat. Frost clung to its brim. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "We need the boy." Ruth did not ask which one. She only shook her head, a small motion that felt enormous. "He's sick," she said. "Both of them are." Isaiah slipped free from her arms before she could stop him. He stood barefoot on the cold floor, smaller than he had ever been, his shoulders hunched like a bird bracing for winter. Elijah grabbed his hand, fingers locking instinctively, twin skin against twin skin. The shorter man noticed. "They're bonded," he said, not unkindly. "That can be inconvenient." Isaiah looked up. His eyes were calm now, too calm. "I'll go," he said, "but he stays." Ruth made a sound that was not a word. The taller man studied Isaiah, as if measuring a weapon. "You understand what we're asking?" Isaiah nodded. He understood far more than they wanted. He had seen rooms without windows. He had heard questions asked until answers bled. He had felt the future pressing against his skull, begging to be written down. "I won't tell you everything," Isaiah said quietly. "Some things end worse if spoken." The men exchanged a glance. The shorter one smiled thinly. "We'll see." They allowed Ruth 1 minute. She knelt in front of Isaiah, cupped his face in her hands, memorizing the map of Himptha, slight scar near his eyebrow. The way his left eye always blinked first when he was tired. "You listen to me?" she whispered. "You survive. You don't give them your soul, no matter how politely they ask." Isaiah leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. For a moment, he was just a child again, warm and trembling. "I'll come back," he said. Though they both knew promises were fragile things, Elijah clung to him, fists buried in Isaiah's shirt. "Don't forget me," he said, voice cracking. Isaiah smiled sadly. "I couldn't if I tried." They took him before the sun fully rose. Ruth watched from the doorway as Isaiah was lifted onto a horse too tall for him, his small hands gripping the saddle horn with practiced resolve. He did not look back. He had already learned that looking back could undo you. The days that followed were hollowed out, scooped clean of meaning. Elijah stopped speaking for a time. He followed Ruth everywhere, slept curled against her spine, woke screaming from dreams he could not explain. He began to feel what Isaiah felt, headaches that came with no warning, sudden chills, a pressure behind the eyes when certain thoughts drifted too close. Ruth knew then that whatever gift Isaiah carried had never belonged to him alone. Isaiah was taken east to a converted schoolhouse guarded by men who pretended not to pray. They fed him well. Oh, they kept him warm. They asked him questions that began gently and ended with silence so heavy it pressed tears from his eyes. They wanted locations, names, timings. They wanted him to see the war as a board laid out before him and tell them where to place their pieces at first. Isaiah answered carefully. He gave them truths that did not kill anyone he could see, bent the future slightly, nudging outcomes just enough to blur certainty. The men noticed. "You're holding back," one said after Isaiah predicted rain that never came. Isaiah stared at his hands. They shook now, constantly. "The future isn't a line," he said. "It's a field. You trample it every time you ask me to walk across." Punishment followed politeness, as it always does. They locked him in a room with no light and asked him to describe battles he had already described. They repeated questions until time lost shape. Isaiah began to forget where he ended and the war began. He heard Elijah's voice, sometimes faint as wind through cracks, counting. Grounding him back on the plantation, Ruth received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence, written in an unfamiliar hand. "He is valuable, but..." Unstable, she folded the paper until it softened, then burned it. Winter deepened. The war dragged on like a wound that refused to close. Isaiah grew thinner, quieter. He began refusing to answer entirely. When pressed, he said nothing at all, staring past his captors as if listening to someone else. One night, as snow fell thick and soundless, Isaiah felt a tearing sensation behind his eyes, like cloth ripping. He collapsed, gasping, and in that moment he saw Elijah not as a memory, but as he was, sitting by the cabin hearth, staring into the fire with an expression Isaiah had never seen before. Fear, yes, but also knowing. Elijah looked up directly at him and whispered, "Stop." Isaiah screamed. They called it a seizure. They restrained him. They whispered about limits and damage. They did not understand that something had already crossed distance they could not measure from that night on. Isaiah could feel Elijah constantly, a steady pulse at the edge of his thoughts. And Elijah, miles away, began dreaming Isaiah's dreams, waking with the taste of iron in his mouth and the echo of questions he had never been asked. The bond tightened, painful and bright. Isaiah stopped eating. The men grew nervous. "If he breaks," one said, "we lose everything." Isaiah lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling he could not see, and thought of Ruth's hands, Elijah's laugh. The small, safe world that had existed for a few brief years. He thought of all the futures he could still change by refusing. When footsteps approached his door again, heavier this time, Isaiah closed his eyes and reached for his brother, not with words, not with visions, but with need. Far away, Elijah sat bolt upright, breath catching in his throat. as if someone had called his name from inside his bones, and for the first time since Isaiah had been taken. Elijah stood, pulled on his coat, and walked toward the door, unaware of where he was, going only that he could no longer stay. Elijah stepped into the night without telling his mother where he was going, because there were no words for a direction that lived inside his chest rather than on any road. Snow crunched beneath his boots, each sound sharp and final, and with every step the pole grew stronger, an ache threaded through his ribs, guiding him east as surely as the stars once guided runaways who could not afford to look up too long. Ruth woke to the sound of the door closing and knew, without seeing, that something irrevocable had begun. She did not chase him. She only stood in the cold doorway, hands pressed to her mouth, whispering both her sons' names into the dark, as if sound itself could protect them. Elijah walked for hours. He avoided main roads by instinct, slipping through trees and frozen fields, stealing warmth from abandoned barns. Hunger gnawed at him, but it felt distant, less urgent than the pressure behind his eyes. Images flickered. At the edge of his thoughts, Isaiah's bare room, the smell of damp stone, a lamp swinging slightly as men argued in low voices. By dawn, Elijah collapsed against a fence post and vomited blood into the snow. At that same hour, Isaiah was dragged from his cot and told he would speak again or be made to disappear quietly, the way inconvenient things often did during wars. He listened without reacting, his face hollow, his eyes sunken but burning with a clarity that frightened even himself. "I can't give you what you want," he said, "but I can show you what happens if you keep asking." They laughed. Isaiah closed his eyes and let go. What followed was not a vision, but a flood. Rooms filled with smoke. Men screaming names that never reached their mouths. Orders followed too late. Victories that rotted into loss. He showed them a future swollen with consequences, cities rebuilt on grief, children memorizing dates they would not understand, flags changing while suffering remained loyal to itself. One man fell to his knees. Another backed away, as if the air had turned poisonous. "Make it stop," someone whispered. Isaiah opened his eyes. Blood ran freely from his nose now, dripping onto the floor, dark against the pale boards. "You don't stop history," he said. "You endure it." They struck him then, afraid and furious, but it felt far away. Isaiah was already slipping, not into darkness, but into something wider. He felt Elijah stumble, felt his brother's pain as if it were his own. The bond flared, unbearable and bright, and for a brief moment the distance between them vanished. Entirely. Elijah saw Isaiah's room. Isaiah saw the fence post, the blood on snow. "Keep walking," Isaiah whispered inside him. "You're close." Elijah woke at noon with his head in a stranger's lap. A black woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl stared down at him, eyes sharp with questions she did not ask. She fed him broth, let him sleep by her fire, and when he left, she pressed a small knife into his hand and said only, "Follow what hurts." By the second night, Elijah reached the town where Isaiah was held. He did not know its name, but his body recognized it immediately. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground itself resisted what he meant to do. The building was guarded. Light spilled from its windows like a warning. Elijah hid behind a stack of crates and waited, shivering, counting breaths, until his hands steadied. He did not have a plan. He had never needed one before. Inside, Isaiah lay barely conscious, fever burning through him. He sensed Elijah's nearness, like a hand hovering just above his skin. Hope hurt worse than despair. When the door finally opened and a guard stepped out to relieve himself against the wall, Elijah moved without thinking. The knife felt enormous in his hand. The act itself was clumsy, desperate. The man fell with a sound like surprise, more than pain. Elijah did not look at what he had done. He ran. He found Isaiah because there was nowhere else to look. The room smelled of sickness and oil. Isaiah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then fixed. "Elijah," he breathed, disbelief breaking. His voice. Elijah dropped to his knees and pulled him close, both of them shaking, neither certain whether the other was real. For a moment, the world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. Boots thundered in the hallway. They did not escape cleanly. Nothing ever does. A bullet grazed Elijah's shoulder. Isaiah collapsed twice before they reached the trees. They ran until lungs tore and the forest swallowed them whole. They hid in a ravine until morning, pressed together, whispering only when necessary. Isaiah's fever worsened. He spoke nonsense, fragments of futures that no longer needed to be seen. Elijah held him and begged him to stay, to rest, to stop looking so far ahead. "I don't know how," Isaiah whispered. "I never learned." Isaiah died 3 days later as the snow finally began to melt, his body giving up in a way that felt almost gentle after so much strain. He died with Elijah's hand in his last breath warm against his brother's skin. Elijah buried him beneath a young tree whose roots had not yet decided where to grow. He stayed there until the ground thawed enough to accept what little he had left to give. Elijah never spoke of what he could feel after that, of the faint echoes that never entirely faded. He lived, he worked. He told no one why he sometimes stopped mid-sentence, listening, or why dates made his hands shake. History moved on, as it always does, indifferent and thorough. Records were lost, names were misfiled. Isaiah Holloway became a rumor that never hardened into fact. But memory does not need permission to survive. It lives in the spaces between official stories, in the quiet insistence that something important once happened here and that someone paid for it in full. And if you are listening now, if this story has followed you longer than you expected, then perhaps that is all it ever wanted to be remembered, just once, without being used again.